Hello, everybody, and welcome. I don't know that we know what we're going to call this special episode, but it's a special episode of the Educated Guest podcast with me, Dr. Cora Sargeant.
And me, Dr. Dan O'Hare.
For those who don't know, a couple of days ago, the Department for Education in the UK released this Keeping Children Safe in Education draft guidance that, when accepted, will have some legal bearing and gives schools, teachers, educators guidance on how to keep children safe in education. But a big part of that is talking about gender diverse children and young people, who they refer to as gender questioning children and young people.
Yeah. Immediately I kind of felt like, oh, hold on, they're not talking about gender diverse trans young people, because the guidance still demonstrates that it is unable to say gender diverse or trans young people. And so the specific section, I guess, that we're going to talk about today is about gender questioning young people. Interestingly, the guidance is able to say lesbian, gay or bisexual young people, but not trans or gender diverse, which I think we referenced it before, maybe gives a kind of a flavour of the tone of the guidance, possibly.
It's amazing that they don't call it sexuality questioning guidance, right? Dr. Ellie Fisher published a systematic review about how different measures of gender identity teach us about how gender identity changes over time. It's a systematic review about longitudinal studies specifically, and she brought together like 21 different studies, published it in the British Journal of Developmental Psychology. It's a cool systematic review, but what is clear in there is when you're talking about like how children think about their own gender identities, when you look at how they describe their own gender identities from middle childhood onwards, they're generally pretty set, and they tend to know what gender they are, children, young people from middle childhood onwards, and the people questioning their gender is adults. So there's a certain irony in calling them gender questioning children, young people, because I think they know who they are. It's us who's questioning their gender.
So I think our hope for this episode is to kind of just talk around and talk through some of the issues that maybe we've kind of thought about in response to that section, I guess with an idea in mind that we'll probably respond to the consultation of that draft guidance. So we've been quite clear that this is draft guidance. It's not our place to give advice about this kind of stuff, but there are a couple of things in here that we thought, given that the guidance was released a couple of days ago, as Cora said, and the consultation is live, that might be useful to talk through and to think about. So yeah, I think that's what we're going to hope to do, and it will be a shorter episode than usual, but one that feels important nonetheless.
And important to do now, and to be live with a topic that needs us to be live with it. But before we get into the actual guidance itself, I wondered if you could talk us through some of the history. Like, how do we get to this place? We've got a strange history in this country when it comes to thinking about gender diverse and LGBT children, young people more broadly. How do we get to this place?
I don't think any discussion of how we got to this place can happen without, and it's something we've talked about before, without us thinking about Section 28, which lots of people are aware of, but I've been increasingly surprised, in the past few years of how the idea of this history is lost, that lots of people haven't heard of it or knew anything, including gay friends that I have, gay and lesbian friends, where they just don't know that their whole schooling was kind of dominated by this section of an Education Act. And this section came from Margaret Thatcher's speech to the Conservative Party in 1987. And I know, Cora, you've kind of repeated this before, and I think it just bears repeating again. At that conference, Margaret Thatcher said that children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, cheated. That then led on, I guess, to the introduction of Section 28 in the Education Act. And this was for schools in England, Scotland and Wales at the time. And the wording of that section was that schools shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality or promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. Really, really strong stuff. And I think the history, for me, part of my undergraduate degree, I did a specialist module in LGBT history and then LGBT psychology, and have been an LGBT youth worker and still kind of research and interest in this area. And I won't be alone in feeling, I guess it's a feeling of kind of history coming back round again to repeat itself. So I don't think actually anyone, am I right in thinking nobody was prosecuted under, the law? But
nobody. But you're right, it had a chilling effect, right? Like, I guess the point of a law like that isn't necessarily to prosecute anyone, but to make sure that everyone feels just a little bit more cautious, that everyone's a bit more stifled, everyone's a bit sort of reluctant to talk about gender diversity, to talk about sexual diversity, and to talk about their own lives. These are LGBT teachers being unable to say, this is how I live my life and it's a legitimate way to be in the world. That phrase, pretended family relationship, always gets me in the gut every time. That these are people's lives being described as pretended family relationships. And no wonder then we have a generation of children, young people. It was 1987, right? That Margaret Thatcher made that speech. And the law only repealed in 2003, if I'm right. Like a generation of children, our generation, going through school, and you and I being those kids, those kids who needed someone to say, I see that you're different in this way, but don't worry, I'm different too, and you're going to be okay. And they couldn't do that.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, Dan, but I remember being in school and I was bullied for being too feminine as what they thought of as a boy. I was homophobically bullied for a decade or more. And nobody could intervene, because to intervene would be to promote the idea that it would be okay to be gay.
Yeah. So I went back to my undergraduate dissertation, and can I read you something that I found?
I'd love it.
So Eve Sedgwick in 1993 gave a conference presentation, and I think wrote an essay called Tendencies. And the reason the reading the Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance kind of sparked this vague memory of Eve Sedgwick's work, and I found the original quote. And the reason I read this is because I think it just feels so relevant to some of the reactions and responses and thoughts to the current Keeping Children Safe guidance, and particularly the draft stuff around gender questioning children. So this is Eve Sedgwick in 1993, and as I read this, I just wonder, how Eve's talking about sexuality here, but there feels like there's a lot of relevance to our discussion on gender and gender diversity. So the quote is that there are many people in the worlds we inhabit, and these psychiatrists are unmistakably among them, who have a strong interest in the dignified treatment of any gay people who may happen to already exist. But the number of persons or institutions by whom the existence of gay people is treated as a precious desideratum, that's something desired, a needed condition of life, is small. The presiding asymmetry of value assignment between hetero and homo goes unchallenged everywhere. Advice on how to help your kids turn out gay, not to mention your students, your parishioners, your therapy clients, or your military subordinates, is less ubiquitous than you might think. On the other hand, the scope of institutions whose programmatic undertaking is to prevent the development of gay people is unimaginably large. This just really struck me as what does she say? The advice on how to help your kids turn out gay, not to mention your students, is kind of, it's just, where is it? And I really kind of got that sense about the relevance here to this discussion in terms of, number one, this idea of gender questioning children has now been included in a statutory safeguarding document. Which kind of feels, why?
Yes. And even in the language of the guidance, it says things like, children who are living in stealth, that is, children and young people who are living as the gender they are peaceably, when no one knows about their medical history, that those children represent there's a safeguarding issue, inherently a safeguarding issue. And it's very difficult to know exactly why they think that that's a safeguarding issue, right? I think the implication is that these kids are, because they're using the bathroom with other people, because they are, on residential events with other people, whatever, because they're living their lives as the gender they are, and they are in stealth, that is inherently problematic.
But I did wonder as I was reading the guidance, the draft guidance, correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like there's... Okay, so at the Festival of Educational Psychology where you spoke, one of the things we talked about was vocabulary and how important vocabulary is. So this section is headed gender questioning. And then it feels like within the guidance that what they could actually really do with is a strong understanding of the difference between, for example, biological sex, gender identity, gender expression. So one of the things, I think, so paragraph 247 of the guidance says that schools and colleges should keep in mind that it's common for children to engage in activities that are less typically associated with their sex. I read that and my little note was, do they mean gender? Then they go on to say girls might play with trucks and which I thought, well, yes, that is true. And I guess that's associated with that is quite maybe my interpretation was a good part of the guidance. Paragraph 259, schools and colleges should consider adopting policies across school and college life that maintain flexibility and avoid rigid rules based on gender stereotypes. So on the one hand, it kind of does seem to recognise that this thing of biological sex is different to gender identity and gender expression, as identified by the types of toys, I guess, that children might play with. But it seems like it's not really getting to grips with, that these things... Gender questioning is different to gender diverse, is different to trans, is different to non-binary, is different. Gender expression is different to gender identity. It kind of feels like it's not yet grappled with all that different vocab.
The way in which we think about gender identity now is distinct from gender expression, whereas in the olden days, we used to think of gender expression and gender identity as basically the same thing. But, Dr. Fisher's systematic review highlights that while gender expression can be more flexible, gender identity is a little more fixed. And that ultimately what we find is that people who are, let's say, trans women in the world can express themselves in more masculine ways without undermining their identity. People who are, trans guys in the world can express themselves in more feminine ways without undermining their identity. Gender expression and gender identity are two separate concepts. Really important. Because when we're talking about gender expression, it's understandable that the Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance would say, we got to make sure that children, young people have access to, haven't got systems and structures that force them down kind of more typical gender expression pathways. But the implication that having more flexibility around those things, or that having more rigidity around those things, will force children, young people who don't conform to think they are trans, is an incorrect understanding. That's not how gender identity functions. Gender identity and gender expression are meaningfully distinct. You can't become trans by enjoying tractors as a young girl. It doesn't work like that.
But have I said this before? Like, doesn't the existence of gender diverse and trans people just in and of itself demonstrate that doesn't work, because they are gender diverse and trans in a world that is so strongly cis-normative, and those gender norms are kind of policed, reinforced, re-established repeatedly through repetition over time, and yet we still have a world where gender diverse people exist. So the mere act of kind of sort of, if that was the case, what you were saying around the I guess the potential argument around why somebody becomes trans, then that all of those forces that are acting on people to be cisgender would kind of in itself mean that there were no trans or gender diverse people anyway.
Absolutely, yeah. This is the critical point fundamentally, is that while the sort of public debate might imply that children, young people are hastened down a pathway, I've reviewed the literature on this topic. There's no evidence of anybody being hastened down any kind of pathway. In fact, when you ask children, young people about their experience, they are always universally describe it as glacially slow, right? They're going to be years on waiting lists. And when they get there, there's a watchful waiting approach where they won't intervene until it's absolutely fundamentally medically necessary, when there's no other option. So kids and young people aren't being hastened down any kind of pathway. In fact, they meet so many barriers to their transition that the fact that anybody transitions shows the strength of feeling and identity that underlies the act, right? Because nobody does this by accident.
One of the things that you kind of talked about earlier, and maybe it's worth coming back to, is the guidance explicitly, which I think is a positive thing, in and of itself, explicitly recognizes that there will be children and young people out there living in stealth, who have undergone and kind of live as the gender that they identify with for a number of years. So I thought, like, that's the first time I think I've seen in a government document that phrase of like living in stealth, which feels like that's a phrase that has come from the community. This is the stuff that we have to do, and this is how I live. But it recognises that. And then in paragraph 267, how can we acknowledge like that in the guidance, that some young gender diverse and trans people will be living in stealth, and then say in paragraph 267, schools must not allow pupils into toilets, change rooms, or boarding or residential accommodation designated for the opposite sex with no exceptions. So it feels to me that what that guidance is saying is we know that it might be children and young people living in stealth, but we're going to out them every time they need the toilet.
Out them every time. Yeah, I think that is what it's saying. I actually think I have a less warm interpretation of the phrase in stealth, because I think you are right that it is the community's language. It's how we describe it. But it's like, that's a description in the context of cisnormative culture. Like, you have to live in stealth at times. I have a friend of mine who's gone abroad. She's left the country and she's decided to live in stealth. She doesn't do that because she wants to. She does that because it's going to be the best way for her to survive where she's going. And I think the guidance here saying in stealth, the way that it frames it is almost that these kids are kind of that being in stealth makes them, the act is somehow malicious, right? Like they're clandestine in their efforts,
concealing it.
Concealing it. And when they some of the commentary and the guidance around what happens when you find out somebody is living in stealth is kind of remarkable. So they say things like, the circumstances of a case and the needs of a child may change over time. For example, it may become known that there are safeguarding issues that were not previously apparent, open brackets, including where a young person is living in stealth, close brackets, or that a decision has placed an unsustainable pressure on a school or college's resources. In such cases, the school or college may need to review their original decision, taking into account the factors set out above. Essentially saying, if you find out that a young person is living in stealth and it's putting unsustainable pressure on your resources, or you find that this is a safeguarding issue, then you can change your decision to support them. Which is radical as a suggestion.
Right. So, because that feels like that's about the framing, right? That feels like that's about the framing and the atmosphere around going to school with, being alongside, teaching and supporting these children and young people. So, I guess like the wording in this draft is very much about very careful, rare, case by case, clinically informed. Maybe we can come back to that idea of like clinically informed and how laughable that idea is. But I guess, the draft, to be clear, the draft doesn't say do not support trans pupils, but or like the practical and like administrative threshold and just the vibe, we wouldn't expect in this atmosphere, I don't think, we wouldn't expect in this atmosphere for institutions and organisations like schools and educational systems to become more liberal, that actually in this atmosphere of kind of caution and rarity and case-by-caseness, the propensity is probably towards kind of like a conservatism in terms of how to and when to support these children and young people. So it feels like, the threshold for just support has just jumped up.
Totally. It absolutely has. And the consequences of seeking that support for children and young people have become much more dire. So, things like having 273, having the correct information about a child is important in the context of schools and colleges fulfilling their safeguarding duties. And they should make sure all relevant staff are aware of a child's biological sex in all cases. You discover a young person is gender diverse, living in stealth, you have a responsibility to tell all relevant staff that they are trans.
We're thinking about some of that, and I'd heard from a colleague this morning who gave their permission to share this, and their one of their children is gender diverse, and they said that on a personal note, my child will never get to go on a school trip with these rules in place, as it defeats the purpose of going away. Having to be in a room on your own. I guess which would be the alternative. We know that you're, let's for example say, assigned male at birth, so even though you're living as a girl, you need to go and sleep with the boys. At which point I imagine the child's going to say, no. Okay, well, you can sleep by yourself. What's the point?
And of course, if you go and you are sleeping on your own, you are outed. Because people will ask, why are you sleeping on your own? Why can't you sleep with the other girls? Well, why can't you use the toilet with the other girls? Well, and these are kids who no one knows is trans, right? And now the policy is going to forcibly out these kids to the people around them. If there's one thing we know about the research, these kids are going to be exposed to harassment if people know that they're trans. So
I was just going to say, the idea of being outed in a wonderfully supportive and inclusive, society, and where actually all these, trans and gender diverse young people are treated with such dignity and care, and that doesn't happen. The transphobia is a societal issue. It did strike me that I think at the start of this section, when they talk about lesbian, gay, or bisexual children and young people, it says, being lesbian, gay, or bisexual isn't a risk in itself. However, they can be sometimes vulnerable to discriminatory bullying. I didn't get the same paragraph at the start of the next section. It felt like, if we're putting our flags on a mast, it's that is important. It does say, I know it does say later, and discriminatory bullying, but it felt much stronger in the LGB section than it did when I'm pretty sure that the literature demonstrates that transphobic bullying, harassment, and prejudice is a bit of an issue.
Yeah, I think it's Turban's research in 2021, 9,711 gender diverse people across all 50 US states found that transition during adolescence increases lifetime suicide risk, and past year suicidal ideation. These are all adults who completed this survey, compared to if they just transitioned socially as adults. But that relationship disappeared, stopped being significant when K through 12 harassment was taken into account. So these kids who socially transition in adolescence, if people know and harass them, then they have this kind of lifetime increased risk of suicide. You're talking about lifetime effects on mental health. So I realize that the safeguarding, the Keeping Children Safe in Education draft guidance talks about a zero tolerance for bullying, which is really important. I'm glad it's in there.
Absolutely.
But our zero tolerance strategies for bullying have been ineffective to this point. Bullying is still a massive problem in adolescence. And while it is a massive problem in adolescence, us creating policies that outs necessarily all trans and gender diverse children and young people will, to my mind, do immediate and irrevocable harm. That's not hyperbole, right? Turban is saying, these are lifetime effects.
Yeah. And
if we expose these kids to harassment, if their only protection is living in stealth, then us exposing them is actively harmful, I would say.
Is it fair to think then about how, this guidance hasn't popped up out of a vacuum? It's been written in a context, and, I'm pretty feel pretty confident saying that, this guidance has been written in a context where there are groups and bodies and, that have consistently argued, one of the things guidance talk about is social transition. And there are groups who have consistently argued that social transition in schools should be treated as a safeguarding issue, not as something that is about well-being and inclusion. So I guess my thought as I was looking at it was this guidance kind of feels like the conceptual shift that these organizations have been pushing for. Their framing has been accepted in that sense, that this is about risk and caution. And I just my reflection within the context is that for those groups that have been campaigning, from my perspective, campaigning for restriction of or removal of supports for, gender diverse and trans young people, I just don't think that this will be a win. This will just be a new starting position. It will be argued again that, this, this doesn't go far enough.
Yes.
I think, and I think we've already seen some of it, that,
yes.
Public responses from some organizations will kind of sound like this is a great step in the right direction, but doesn't go far enough.
There are moments in this document, I think, that do head in that kind of direction that some organizations are seeking. 269 is really interesting. When discussing requests to socially transition, schools and colleges should take time to sensitively explain that supporting any degree of social transition will not include allowing access to toilets, changing rooms, or boarding or residential accommodation designed for the opposite sex, and will not include allowing children to join PE classes designated for the opposite sex where there are safety reasons for single-sex PE. They are... That is essentially, you need to explain to a child or young person who's considering social transition that we won't support it systemically. And that maybe that will convince them not to do it. I think, that is one of the moments in the piece where I think, I don't know whether it, to my mind, looks an awful lot like trying to dissuade children and young people from transitioning.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I mean, so in that vein, one of the paragraphs that stuck out to me was 265, which says the CAS review acknowledges that older children will generally have greater agency to make their own decisions. Maintaining flexibility and keeping children's options open will help to avoid a child feeling they're under pressure to commit to potentially irrevocable pathway when they are young, which just doesn't seem to make sense to me, because it's not choosing between intervening versus not intervening. That isn't what this is about. It's choosing between intervening in ways that support transpossibility, or intervening in ways that protect normative paths and outcomes.
Totally. Yes. And I think implicitly the guidance does seem to back the idea that social transition is an active intervention and refusing social transition is not. And that,
but one is labelled neutral.
One is labelled neutral. One is the neutral option. The other one is not a neutral option. I did want to kind of go back, because the Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance has this kind of, because it leans on the CAS review leans on systematic review leans on the original research. The gentle, tiny misinterpretations of each lead to big misinterpretations in the guidance. And the active intervention one is one of the really interesting ones. So they say very clearly that social transition should be considered an active intervention. 264 in the Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance says, the CAS review acknowledged that there is a lack of good evidence on the long-term impact of social transition on young people, but it is clear that social transition should be viewed as an active intervention that may have significant effects on the child or young person in terms of their psychological functioning and longer-term outcomes. Significant effects should be considered an active intervention. So we go back to the CAS review. The CAS review 12.5 says, social transition may not be thought of as an intervention or treatment because it is not something that happens in a healthcare setting, and it is within the agency of an adolescent to do for themselves. However, in an NHS setting, it is important to view it as an active intervention because it may have significant effects on the child or young person in terms of their psychological functioning and long-term outcomes.
That's very different.
In the NHS, is what Cass said. So they kind of omitted that. But Cass still says, yeah, sure, it could have significant effects. We go deeper into the Cass review. Okay. 76. The systematic review showed no clear evidence that social transition in childhood has any positive or negative mental health outcomes, and relatively weak evidence for any effect in adolescence. So when you get drilled down to it, there's no evidence that social transition has any effect long-term in childhood, and only weak evidence in adolescence. So we go a bit deeper.
Okay. Oh, we're going down the spiral. I'm liking this. Or up the spiral. We're going in one direction. We're going down. Let's go.
A Charlie Day with a corkboard and red string behind me. Let's go. 12.24. One study looking at transgender adults found that lifetime suicide attempts and suicidal ideation in the past year was higher among those who had socially transitioned as adolescents compared to those who had socially transitioned in adulthood. So she only mentions the one study. That's the evidence for that point. Go back to the systematic review that she's referencing. Hall. There were inconsistent results between studies. 2 studies suggest that there may be benefit associated with chosen name use in adolescence. However, in another study, one study, lifetime suicide attempts and past year suicidal ideation was higher among those socially transitioning as adolescents compared to those socially transitioning as adults. So we go back to that one study, and it's the Turban study I talked about, 9,711 people. And that association between adolescent social transition and lifetime suicide rate increases goes away when you control for K through 12 harassment.
Right. I was just going to say, is it the discrimination point?
So the little misinterpretations lead to this avalanche of misinterpretation, right?
Like really amplified over each step.
Tiny misinterpretations keep getting amplified as each person just looks to the one below and says, well, they said this, so... Yeah. Turban says, actually, social transition in adolescence doesn't increase any risk of long-term outcome negatively. It just increases the risk of harassment, and harassment does that. Yeah. So then Hall says, well, slight minor misinterpretation, saying that study did say that harassment, the social transition in adolescence led to lifetime suicidal attempt increase, but that there were 2 other studies that said the opposite. Yeah. And then Cass just sort of ignored those 2 studies and focused on the one that was slightly misinterpreted, which leads then to the Keeping Children Safe in Education to say, this is not a neutral this is not a neutral act. This is an active intervention with, and they say, significant effects on the child or young person in terms of their psychological functioning and longer-term outcomes. Primary schools should exercise particular caution, and we would expect support for full social transition to be agreed very rarely. That point, that we have to be very, very cautious, is driven by a series of points that has gone through multiple pieces of literature that lead back to one study that has been misinterpreted throughout.
Right. So when a school is told to be very careful and very rare about supporting a, let's use the wording of a gender questioning child with social transition, but isn't told to equally be careful about, reinforcing existing gender norms and conformity through the availability of facilities, it's like, it's not the overt hostility either within the system. It's like procedural hostility, but in one direction, which feels, like if you're tracing it through that series of missteps that kind of get amplified each time, it's kind of, it feels really hard to unpick, and you're kind of like wading a bit rather than it being a very clear, but that's misinterpreted, because actually who in a school system has the space, time and access to academic papers to do what you've just done?
Absolutely.
To go from a statutory guidance to an NHS government report to a review to the original paper, that's just not going to happen.
I don't expect anybody will do that. And of course, the problem is that it looks like it's really robust because they keep saying, well, the Cass review was this independent review that commissioned load of systematic reviews. So, the Cass review says this thing, therefore it must be true. And when they lean on the CAS review in the Keeping Children Safe in Education report guidance, it looks very robust. But when you get down to it, you realize it's a paper tiger. Like it looks robust, but actually underneath it, the actual evidence doesn't support the conclusions that this guidance is suggesting. The other one is in social transition and medical pathway. You want to do it one more time? This happens multiple times.
Okay.
This one's a really good one as well. So they say social transition, medical pathways. Schools should be 258. Schools should be particularly conscious of safeguarding concerns relating to primary aged children. For example, the CAS review noted evidence that children who socially transition before puberty and those who transition prior to receiving clinical advice are more likely to proceed to a medical pathway than those who do not.
Okay.
A comparative statement.
Okay.
Those who transition before puberty and who don't
yeah, let's go.
to proceed to a medical pathway than those who do not, than those who socially transition later or those who don't socially transition are more likely. A direct comparative statement. 76 of the CAS review says, however, those who had socially transitioned at an earlier age and or prior to being seen in clinic were more likely to proceed to a medical pathway. So you're on your way, right? CAS did say that, understandable that the Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance would say the same thing.
Yeah.
So let's go back to Hall in the systematic review. In this review, 2 studies suggest that children who socially transition are more likely to continue to experience gender dysphoria or incongruence in adolescence. Though one study found differences by birth registered sex, and the other study, they say one of these studies, which is the other of the 2, also reported that the majority of those who socially transitioned progressed to medical intervention. That's the one study that they're talking about when it comes to medical intervention. One study. It's Olson's study. 317 binary socially transitioned transgender children, 208 trans girls, 109 trans boys. And they looked at those who had socially transitioned quite young and whether or not 5 years later they were still socially transitioned. And they logged whether or not they had moved on to gender affirming hormones or puberty blockers. But this sample isn't representative. The average US household income is $83,000. The mode household income for these participants was over $125,000. Okay. So this is a affluent sample, a privileged sample, and only 59.9% moved on to puberty blockers or gender affirming hormones, had some kind of medical intervention by the end of the study. So it is technically true to say that the majority of the participants in this study moved on to medical intervention, but there's no control group. There's no comparator. There's no group of children in this study who weren't supported in their social transition. It's literally just this group. And it wasn't designed. It didn't have a hypothesis around how many children would go on to medical intervention. It wasn't, the design of the study isn't designed to check how many. It's not a representative sample. Yeah. There's no comparator group. It's not designed to answer that question. So when they say, most children, it's from this one sample study of just 300 kids, not designed to answer that question at all. Yeah. And the authors don't conclude that. That's not what they conclude. So that one study gets put into Hall's systematic review, which gets moved up through CAS, which gets moved up to the Keeping Children Safe in Education, who says boldly, those who socially transition before puberty are more likely to proceed to a medical pathway than those who do not. The evidence has no hope, even the cited evidence that they offer.
Of getting through to the guidance.
Has no hope, with no hope of supporting the point that it's being used to inform. Absolutely no hope.
I mean, both those examples, thank you. I have, hearing that, I've not done that tracking back. It's, I think that process in itself. And I think that's a process that lots of people who have, for example, lots of our colleagues who have done doctorates and research will know. If you look at a piece of, a government piece of research that draws on a systematic review, you go back to the primary piece of research. I don't think it's uncommon in a research sphere to kind of think, oh, I don't think they originally said that, or they didn't say it quite that. And hence, at Bristol Uni, when we're talking to students about their thesis journeys and their literature reviews, return to the primary research if you're thinking about like some of these arguments and some of these points, because as you've demonstrated, those nuances really do matter, particularly in a process of amplification in a context that we've already discussed and talked about.
It really does. I mean, what's wild to me is that it's understandable, right?
Yeah.
Like nobody is misbehaving here, I don't think. Like keeping children safe. The DFE saying, well, the CAS review said this, so let's take it as standard that it's true. And the CAS review doing what it did, which is to lean on the systematic review, commission systematic reviews to do their work. That's all good. Hall and colleagues, I don't think they have misinterpreted much here. And where they have given one misinterpretation, at least, I think, I think that's a pretty understandable small misinterpretation that we all make when we conduct studies.
Yeah.
But the consequences here are cataclysmic. You're talking about guidance that's saying, well, because social transition is considered to have these long-term effects, we shouldn't support it, which is going to have direct, immediate influences on children and young people today. Yeah. The moment that this goes live, this guidance stops being a consultation and becomes real guidance, it has the risk of doing real harm on the basis of no evidence to support the position that it's holding, to my mind. And bearing in mind, you and I are writing and moments away, hopefully, from publishing. We've responded to peer review an article where we review the literature in this field. 147 references in that article. And we are, our understanding of what's happening in this field is that these children and young people are real. They're real right now. You can literally go and talk to them. I've literally done that. I've gone to residential events with them and talked to them. And they're trying to live their lives. And the government in this guidance is saying, your lives are dangerous. You're a safeguarding risk. And we shouldn't permit you to live authentically in this world if we can avoid it.
And for a piece of guidance that is about safeguarding children, my interpretation was that actually was very little in the guidance, given what we know about the lives and experiences of trans and gender diverse people generally, but also thinking about the lives and experiences of trans young people. There seems very little about how we actually protect and safeguard gender diverse and trans young people. And you're absolutely right, at the point that this stops becoming draft guidance, it becomes statutory guidance. And so maybe that's a great point to, point out to listeners that the government consultation for this is open until the 22nd of April. It would be great for some responses. I think my understanding is that the consultation is possibly unhelpfully long, but a good thing to do, because I guess what we're talking about is the real everyday lives and experiences of gender diverse and trans young people. And maybe it could be argued that that's not what the guidance is talking about, because it's talking about gender questioning, which is very different. But I guess, that's who is going to be or will be affected. So the government, this draft guidance is available on gov.uk. We can probably link to the guidance in the show notes and link to the consultation as well. But I guess our hope for this kind of shorter, kind of special episode, we're doing this at 2 p.m. on a Saturday, is just to kind of like think about it, to just talk about it, to share some thoughts, to look at some of the research, some of the reactions. And so we hope you found it an interesting conversation.
Yeah, you're not alone out there. I think that's, I think one of the emotional effects of all of this continues to be that it kind of, segregates us, isolates us. It makes us feel like, wait, how can all this be the case? How can people be saying this stuff in such officious, formal ways? as though it's true that we're a safeguarding risk to people, that that children and young people might be at risk if we permit them to allow to be their authentic selves, that children and young people in stealth might be doing something clandestine or troublesome by living their lives.
Yeah.
I think I want people to know that, I want you to know you're not alone. You have a child or young person, or if you yourself are gender diverse, or if you just know people in your life who are, just know that you're not alone out there. And, I don't know how much we are putting our thumb on the scale. I don't know how much the needle is moving from our efforts. But just know that we're not going to stop.
On that, thanks for joining us for this special edition, rapid response, emergency podcast. I don't know, whatever we're going to call this. We couldn't think of a name, but...
Can we call it Cora Almost Cries a Lot?
Cora, okay, let's call it that. That might not hit the Google kind of SEO, like when people are searching.
This is true.
So we might want to call it something else. That might be subtitle? I don't know. But, thanks for the time on a Saturday, and it's been as always, it's been a pleasure to discuss and think and talk with you. And I think we both hope that this episode is thought-provoking, useful, helpful, and we're going to see you soon.
We see you soon. We love you.
We love you. Ciao.